Coffee goes on that side. And next time, don't stand in the middle like that. This isn't a photo op. Julian Carter didn't even look up as he spoke. His voice carried the effortless condescension of someone who'd spent far too long being the loudest man in the room. He flipped open his leather briefcase with the kind of practiced flourish that said, "I belong here. You don't." The woman standing by the bench didn't move. Not at first. Her posture was straight, still, unreadable. That alone seemed to irritate him. He glanced at her, finally, and gave a little scoff. "You knew? Or just lost?" Still no answer. Julian looked around as if expecting someone else to step in, then smirked and lowered his voice for his client's benefit. "They really lowered the bar lately. I miss when courtrooms had standards." A couple of his colleagues chuckled nervously. The clerk at the far end of the room looked up sharply, but said nothing. "She must be with the translation team," Julian muttered. "Or catering." Another smirk. "Or maybe she's just another intern trying to look important. Cute folder, though. Does it come with crayons?" She didn't react. She simply stepped back, calm, composed, unbothered. That made him even more irritated. Julian adjusted his tie and turned to one of the interns beside him. When you're in this room long enough, you start to recognize who the real players are and who's just taking up space. Before anyone could respond, the courtroom door closed quietly behind the bailiff. "All rise for the Honorable Judge, Maya Green." Silence. Chairs scraped against the polished floor. Julian rose, halfway through a breathless chuckle, before freezing mid-motion. The woman, the one he'd insulted without pause or doubt, stepped calmly behind the bench. She slid into the black robe that had been draped neatly over the chair. Without breaking eye contact, she picked up the gavel and gave it a single, deliberate tap. "You may be seated." Julian sat, but the damage was done. His smug expression had already vanished. What remained was something more primal: discomfort, shame, panic. Judge Green adjusted a page on her docket, her voice even, crisp. "Case number 43-218, People v. Colton. Representation?" Julian cleared his throat. "Julian Carter for the defense." The words came out flat, hollow. She glanced at him. "Mr. Carter, thank you for your commentary this morning. I trust it won't interfere with your ability to proceed professionally." He felt the heat crawl up his neck. "Of course not, Your Honor." "Good." The prosecutor began her opening statement, but Julian barely heard her. He was too aware of the people behind him, of the fact that the interns had gone quiet, of the judge's eyes, sharp, still, and impossible to ignore. Every phrase he'd tossed so casually now echoed back like a slap in his own face. And somehow, Judge Green hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a scene. She hadn't needed to. She'd just let the truth sit there between them, huge and humiliating. When it came time for his opening, Julian stood. His voice trembled. He stumbled once, twice, reaching for words that had always come easy. The jury didn't seem to be listening. And when he caught the faintest smile tugging at the corner of Judge Green's mouth, he knew. She had dismantled him, without saying a word. Julian slammed the pen onto his notepad, the tip snapping audibly against the paper. The sound drew a glance from the clerk, which he promptly ignored. His jaw clenched, tongue pressed hard against his teeth. No one had dared laugh, but he could feel it, that tight, humming silence people used to hold back grins. He had become the punchline, and she hadn't even said a word. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, flipping through his notes with unnecessary force. "Of all the damn judges." His client leaned over. "You good?" Julian gave a thin, sharp smile. "Fine, just fine. I didn't expect today's hearing to come with surprise casting." The client chuckled uneasily, clearly unsure if that was supposed to be funny. Julian wasn't. He watched Judge Green return to the bench, her robe settling over her shoulders like a curtain closing on a show he hadn't been invited to. She didn't meet his eyes, not even once. That annoyed him more than he could admit. The deliberate composure. The silence. The way she didn't even bother to be smug, like he didn't deserve her time. When she spoke again, her voice was measured, controlled. "We'll proceed with the witness testimony." The bailiff brought in the first witness. A quiet young man, early 20s, dressed like he'd just come from an overnight shift. Julian didn't even glance at him. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. As the prosecutor began questioning, Julian whispered to his assistant, loud enough for the nearest rows to hear, "Let me guess, character witness? Or maybe he's just here to nod and look sympathetic." The assistant hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. Julian smirked. "Don't worry. The judge can't hear us. She's too busy polishing her halo." Across the room, Judge Green turned a page in her folder. Slowly, precisely, without looking up. Julian's voice rose slightly. "So tell me, Mr. Rodriguez," he called during cross. "You remember everything about that night perfectly, huh? You didn't happen to forget the part where you lied to get a lighter sentence?" Objection. "Sustained," Judge Green said calmly. Julian raised his eyebrows dramatically. "I was just asking." Judge Green didn't blink. "You may rephrase." He rolled his eyes. "Of course. Wouldn't want to upset the decorum." The witness looked rattled. That gave Julian a sliver of satisfaction. But not enough. As the day wore on, his irritation festered. Every time Judge Green ruled against one of his objections, he sighed, audibly. Every time she allowed the prosecutor to continue, he muttered about bias and personal crusades. At one point, he leaned toward the defense table and said, "It's funny, isn't it? The way they talk about equality, until they get a robe. Then it's just payback." His client said nothing. Julian didn't notice, or didn't care. When Judge Green called for a break, he stood up before anyone else, strutted down the aisle like he owned it. Out in the hallway, he barked into his phone. "No, I'm telling you, this woman's got an agenda. She's not here to rule, she's here to make a point." Pause. "No, I don't care what the docket says. You should have seen the way she looked at me." Another pause. "Don't act like I'm imagining it. This whole thing stinks of performance." He caught sight of a law student watching from across the hall and sneered, "Enjoy the circus, sweetheart. Don't forget your popcorn." Back inside, Judge Green returned precisely on time. Julian, 10 seconds late, entered with his phone still in hand. She gave him a look, not scolding, not angry, just observant. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I trust your phone call is concluded." He slipped it into his pocket. "Just tying up a loose end. Hope that's acceptable, Your Honor." "It's customary to observe the rules of decorum in my courtroom," she said, regardless of personal inconveniences. Julian grinned tightly. "Well, I suppose some of us have to work a little harder to be heard." A flicker passed through the room. The air chilled. Judge Green said nothing. Julian took his seat, still smiling, though his eyes had hardened. The second witness was called. Julian let his leg bounce beneath the table. He tapped his fingers on the wood in a staccato rhythm, louder than necessary. When the witness described seeing the defendant at the scene, Julian snorted. "Of course you did. You all seem to have perfect memories when you're trying to save your own neck." "Mr. Carter," Judge Green warned. He raised his hands. "Just commentary, Your Honor. Colorful. Nothing more." "This is not a place for color," she said. That line hit harder than he expected. He froze. She had said it plainly, but the meaning buried underneath it struck deep. A few people in the courtroom shifted in their chairs. The tension was no longer just between him and the bench. It had expanded, bled out into the walls, into the silence. For the first time, Julian Carter felt something he hadn't felt in a courtroom in years. Alone. Julian leaned back in his chair, arms folded, legs crossed, his eyes locked on Judge Green like a predator waiting for a mistake. But she offered him nothing. No glance, no sigh, no trace of irritation. That alone infuriated him. It was like arguing with a mirror that refused to reflect your existence. The third witness was called. A woman in her mid-30s, professional, clear-voiced, direct. She stated her name, her occupation, and her relation to the events in question. Julian was barely listening. He tapped his pen, fast and loud, then sighed theatrically as if the entire process bored him to death. As she began recounting what she saw the night of the incident, he whispered, "Oh, here we go. Another hero, with selective memory." His assistant flinched. When it was his turn to cross-examine, Julian stood too quickly, his chair groaning under the abrupt movement. He stalked to the front like a man with something to prove. "Miss Andrews," he began with a syrupy tone that barely masked his contempt. "Forgive me, but you've testified under oath that you saw my client near the scene, at night from across the street, during a downpour?" "Yes," she replied, calm. "There was street lighting, and I had a clear view." "Street lighting?" He chuckled. "Do you happen to work for the Department of Illumination, or is this just wishful thinking?" "Objection," the prosecutor said sharply. "Withdrawn," Julian snapped, before Judge Green could respond. He turned back to the witness with a toothy smile. "Just trying to establish how reliable your superhero vision really is." Miss Andrews didn't respond. Julian stepped closer. "You say you saw my client run. Tell me, did you also see whether he levitated or perhaps teleported?" The courtroom was silent. Even the prosecutor looked too stunned to object. Judge Green spoke, calm but cold. "Mr. Carter." He turned to her, face smug. "Yes, Your Honor." "This is a courtroom, not a stand-up club. If you intend to continue questioning, do so respectfully." He tilted his head, voice oily. "Of course. I wouldn't want to undermine the decorum." Her eyes didn't waver. "Continue." Julian walked back to his table and gestured dramatically with both hands. "No further questions for the clairvoyant." He sat. Nobody laughed. The moment hung in the air like smoke, thick, awkward, heavy. Judge Green made a note, then calmly dismissed the witness. When she looked up again, her gaze moved to Julian like a slow-moving blade. "We'll resume with closing arguments tomorrow. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell, and chairs scraped again. People rose. The judge disappeared behind the door, but this time, Julian didn't move. He sat frozen, chewing the inside of his cheek. When the courtroom cleared, he grabbed his briefcase roughly and shoved a folder inside without looking. His assistant lingered, hesitant. "What?" he snapped. She swallowed. "You don't think maybe you're pushing too hard?" Julian narrowed his eyes. "Are you asking me to be soft on testimony? Because the moment I start coddling witnesses is the moment I stop winning." "I didn't mean—" "Then don't suggest," he said sharply. "This isn't a feelings contest. It's a trial." He brushed past her and headed down the corridor, his steps echoing off marble tiles. As he reached the elevators, two young lawyers standing nearby quieted mid-conversation. He caught the tail end of it. His name, Judge Green's name, a stifled laugh. He wheeled on them. "Something funny, gentlemen?" They straightened, startled. "No, sir." "Then maybe keep your mouths shut when grown-ups are talking," he sneered. Inside the elevator, alone, he stared at his reflection in the mirrored walls. For a split second, his face looked tired, older than it had that morning. He smoothed his tie and rolled his shoulders. "She's playing the game," he whispered to himself. "She's making me the villain." The elevator chimed. As the doors opened, his phone buzzed. A text from one of the senior partners at his firm. "Careful, Julian. You're making headlines for the wrong reasons." He stared at the screen, then turned it off. Outside, the sky had turned a dull gray. Rain threatened, hovering just above the city but never falling. Julian lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, dragging hard. Across the street, A young girl stared at him from behind her mother's coat. He glared at her until she turned away. He exhaled smoke. This whole thing's a joke. But the truth was, the courtroom wasn't laughing. And for the first time, Julian Carter wasn't sure he'd win just by being louder. Julian arrived early the next morning, earlier than usual, as if reclaiming a few extra minutes in the courtroom would somehow tilt the balance back in his favor. He sat at the defense table, back straight, jaw tight, watching the doors. When Judge Green entered, he didn't rise until the very last moment, making a point to finish his notes before standing. A childish gesture, but the only one he felt he could afford. "We'll begin with closing arguments," Judge Green announced after confirming attendance. Her tone was crisp, even, unshakable. Julian stood, buttoned his jacket slowly, and stepped forward with a swagger that felt forced even to him. He cleared his throat, looked at the jury, then at the judge. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we've seen over the last few days is what happens when the justice system gets emotional." There was a pause, just long enough to create tension. A parade of unreliable witnesses, vague memories wrapped in dramatic packaging, and a judge, he gestured slightly toward the bench, who has allowed this courtroom to drift dangerously close to theater. Murmurs rose. The prosecutor's eyes widened. Judge Green did not react. Not with so much as a blink. Julian continued. "Now I know it's become fashionable to put certain people on pedestals just for existing in a robe. Mr. Carter," Judge Green interjected, her voice steady but colder than before. "This is your closing statement, not a monologue." "Of course, Your Honor," he said with false deference, then turned back to the jury. "Let me make one thing clear. We're not here to make statements. We're here to determine whether the prosecution has met its burden, whether they have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that my client committed a crime. They haven't. And all the righteous tone in the world can't change that," he went on, picking apart testimony with sarcastic flourishes, exaggerating inconsistencies, mocking phrasing, mimicking a few witnesses with cruel impersonations. Some jurors frowned. One shook his head. Julian didn't care. When he returned to his seat, he shot a quick look toward Judge Green, expecting a reprimand. He didn't get one. She simply looked down, wrote something, and turned to the prosecution. "Ms. Ortega, you're closing." The prosecutor rose, calm, clear, and devastatingly precise. She spoke about accountability, about facts, about the arrogance of assuming one's voice matters more because it's louder. Julian rolled his eyes so hard his entire head tilted. He whispered to his assistant, "She's practically campaigning. Someone give her a podium." But no one laughed. When Judge Green dismissed the jury to deliberate, the room emptied slowly. Julian remained seated, arms folded, leg bouncing. "You think I pushed too far?" he asked. His assistant hesitated. "I think you made it personal." "Of course I made it personal," he snapped. "She did the moment she walked in with that look on her face like she was better than the rest of us." "She never said anything." "Exactly," he hissed. "That smug silence, that self-righteous, holier-than-thou silence. She thinks she's untouchable." The assistant looked away. Minutes later, the jury returned. The room filled again. Everyone stood. Judge Green addressed the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "Please read it." "We find the defendant guilty on all charges." Gasps echoed. Julian didn't move. His expression froze, then melted into disbelief. He turned slowly to his client, who stared at him with a mix of rage and betrayal. "You said this was a slam dunk." They bought the performance," Julian muttered. "This wasn't about law. This was politics." The bailiff approached. The defendant stood, cuffed. As they led him away, he spat, "You lost me my life, Carter!" Julian sat down, deflated. Across the courtroom, Judge Green removed her glasses, folded them neatly, and spoke. "Court is adjourned." But then she added, almost as an afterthought, And Mr. Carter, this court expects better, in conduct and in character. She stood. No theatrics, no raised voice, just finality. As she exited, the room remained still. Julian looked around. No one would meet his eye, not his assistant, not his peers, not even the clerk. He was alone, truly alone now, and for the first time in his career, no one was listening. The following morning, the courtroom buzzed with an energy Julian wasn't used to. The air was thick with anticipation, but it wasn't for the usual reason. The trial was about to wrap up, but the tension felt different today. It wasn't the usual rhythm of a high-stakes case. It was more personal, more urgent. The weight of judgment loomed heavily over Julian, and it wasn't just the verdict that was hanging over him. It was the smoldering realization that his arrogance, his underestimation of Judge Green, had led him into a fight he wasn't prepared for. He sat at the defense table, carefully adjusting his tie, fidgeting with the cufflinks that had always been a comforting sign of control. But there was no comfort in them today. His fingers felt stiff, like they didn't belong to him. He kept replaying his cross-examination of the last witness, the way he'd taunted her, the way his sarcasm had backfired, the way it had all gone wrong. He'd expected to command the room, to hold it in his palm as always. Instead, Judge Green had shown him that his bravado didn't matter, his words didn't matter, his reputation didn't matter, not when the truth was this obvious. He could hear his own voice echoing in his head. This isn't a stand-up show. This is a trial. His own words, used against him. And it stung. The door opened, and Judge Green stepped back onto the bench. The room fell silent, as it always did when she entered. But this time it felt like the calm before a storm. Julian took his seat, adjusting his papers again, trying to steady his shaking hands. The courtroom felt colder, quieter. Even his client sat rigidly beside him, his once hopeful eyes now clouded with uncertainty. The judge's gaze swept over the room, her expression unreadable. She tapped the gavel lightly, calling the court to order. Mr. Carter, are you prepared for your closing remarks? Julian stood slowly, his legs heavy, but his face was the same as always, the confident mask, the cool facade. He walked toward the jury box with deliberate steps, but there was no pep in his stride today, no smugness. The courtroom had already shifted. His role was no longer a given. He had been the one to ridicule, to mock, to belittle. But now, with each passing moment, the weight of his own arrogance pressed harder against his chest. His jaw tightened as he prepared to speak. His voice rang out, but it lacked the usual conviction. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Julian began, his voice forced but still firm, what you have witnessed in this courtroom over the past few days is a performance, a charade, a story spun to tug at your emotions, to manipulate your perception of the facts. His eyes flickered to Judge Green for a brief moment. And unfortunately, our legal system is not built on feelings. It is built on the law, and the law, quite frankly, is on our side. He paced slightly in front of the jury, his arms wide. What I've been hearing from the prosecution, and even from the bench, is a lot of lofty ideals. But I ask you to look beyond the theatrics, beyond the grandiose speeches. Look at the facts. The supposed evidence that the prosecution has presented is nothing but speculation, assumptions, and lies. This entire case has been about making you feel something, not think. Julian paused, his eyes scanning the jury, a cocky grin tugging at his lips. And I know. Don't worry, Your Honor. I'm sure you're already formulating some little rebuttal to what I'm saying, but I can see it in their eyes. They're with me. They see through this farce, don't they? The jury sat still, their faces unreadable, but there was a flicker of discomfort in the air. Julian noticed it, but he pushed forward, undeterred. He looked back at the judge. Judge Green, as usual, has allowed this circus to continue. bending the rules of decorum to fit the narrative she wants to create. And I've had enough. This trial isn't about justice. It's about proving a point, a personal point. Because we all know how she feels about people like me. He motioned towards the jury, as if to include them in his implied conspiracy. She's got her own agenda, and it's been clear from the start. He could hear the murmurs in the courtroom, the shuffling of papers, the shifting of weight. Some of the faces were tense, some were angry, but he didn't care. He couldn't. He had to win. He had to keep his grip on this case. He was used to the applause, to the recognition, to being the best. But now, his grip was slipping, and the realization gnawed at him like a cold weight. As Julian spoke, his words grew more pointed, more cutting. Do you really believe, after everything we've seen, that this was ever about the facts? This wasn't about justice. It was about someone with a vendetta trying to make an example of my client. Someone who's so consumed by her own biases that she can't see the truth staring her right in the face. He turned to the jury again, his voice a little louder now, like he was goading them, daring them to respond. You've heard enough. You've seen enough. And I trust that you're not so naive as to fall for the melodrama. You know what this is about. Julian's last words hung in the air, thick and cutting. The room fell silent. His hand trembled slightly as he returned to his seat. He glanced at his client, who refused to meet his gaze, eyes locked down. There was a small, hollow pit in his stomach. He wanted to shout, to throw something. But instead, he sat back, pretending like the weight of what was coming didn't matter. The prosecutor stood up to make her rebuttal, but Julian couldn't focus on her words. Instead, he watched Judge Green's expression remain unchanged, that calm exterior she always wore. It was like she'd been holding her breath this entire time, waiting for him to self-destruct. And when the moment finally arrived, when the jury returned with their verdict, Julian stood again, his heart racing, but his face an unreadable mask. The foreman's words echoed in the chamber, each syllable heavier than the last. We find the defendant guilty on all charges. A wave of disbelief hit him like a physical blow. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. His head was spinning. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had everything, every advantage. Yet here he was, undone. The bailiff led the defendant away. Julian didn't look at him. He didn't want to see the mixture of anger and despair in his eyes. He didn't want to see his own failure reflected back at him. But there was no hiding from it now. And as Judge Green prepared to adjourn the court, Julian realized something. The arrogance, the dismissive attitude, the insults, they had all led him here, to this moment. And now, for the first time, he was nothing. Just another failure in a long line of men who thought they could control the game. As the courtroom emptied, Julian remained seated for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the empty space where his client had once sat. The hum of conversation around him seemed muffled, distant. His mind raced, but his thoughts were a blur, tangled in frustration and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had everything he had built, all his carefully crafted words, and the power he had wielded in every case, crumbled in a single moment? Outside the courtroom, the world continued on as usual. The same cars sped by on the road outside. The same voices echoed in the halls. But inside, Julian knew something had shifted irrevocably. He could feel it, deep in his bones. For the first time in his career, he had lost not just the case, but something far more significant, his own sense of control. As the doors to the courthouse closed behind him, he walked into the brisk air, his collar pulled up against the chill. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The world had seen him for who he truly was, a man who used his words to belittle, to dismiss, to make others feel small. But in the end, it wasn't his words that mattered. It was the truth. And truth had a way of making itself known, no matter how much you tried to bury it. If you found yourself moved by this story, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, and subscribe to stay updated on more stories that challenge the status quo.